All right, so my wife forced me to watch The Bachelor, and it's really good. No, but seriously, like it's really good. And during quarantine, everyone's looking for something new to watch, and I figured, I watch The Bachelor and see how it is, and it is pretty messy. And after watching the first few episodes, I was thinking to myself, what does Matt James's chart look like? As an astrologer, I'm always interested to see, what this person's chart looks like, or even wonder what planet placements they have, what's their moon sign, their rising, all that good stuff. So in this video, I'm going to talk about as much as I know or I can see from his chart and see if I can find out what makes him him. So I've never watched The Bachelor before, but as I'm watching this season, something is very apparent and something is uniquely different about this season that I'm sure you all know. Matt James is the first Black Bachelor, and I am interested to know what his chart looks like and then see if I can find in his chart what he's looking for in a woman. I mean, that is what he's on The Bachelor for, right? So let's set a baseline. What I can find from doing some quick Googleation, Matt was born December 5th, 1991. Matt is finishing up his Saturn return. So while we know his birth date and we know where he was born, we don't know the time of his birth. So we can only go by his planet placements. And since we don't have the time of birth, we don't have a rising sign. So we can figure out what energies are working for Matt, but we won't necessarily know where in his life they're working for him, or where in their life that they'll have an effect on him. So as we can see from his chart, he's a Sagittarius sun with a Sagittarius moon. Similar to other fire signs, Sagittarius people are usually high energy, fun-spirited, outgoing, people that usually don't like much routine. They like spontaneity and variety. So with a Sagittarius moon, like Matt has, you'll see a lot of those same qualities that I just mentioned for someone with a Sagittarius sun, but now think about them as on a more of an emotional level. People with a Sagittarius moon tend to have a very strong emotional connection to morality and righteousness, and they really have a strong sense of what's right and wrong. You'll also find that Sagittarius moons tend to have a yearning for all things foreign, whether they be abroad or just something that they're not used to seeing all the time. Something sort of away from their usual day-to-day routine. They have a yearning for learning in a lot of different ways and different capacities. Think about people with a Sagittarius moon as people who love adventure, love finding things out. They love to explore. This is the emotional connection that you find when someone has a Sagittarius moon. They're always looking for adventure. They're always looking for spontaneity. They're always looking to see what they can find beyond what they've already known. A lot of this comes from the ruling planet Jupiter, which is the planet of philosophy. I teach is the phrase of Jupiter. It rules the higher mind and foreign travel and adventure, the superconscious. And you can see this almost on day one when he started the season out with a prayer, right? Jupiter and Sagittarius rules religion and it rules philosophy. It rules the things that we hold dear as a sense or a guide of morality. And Matt is not shy about his faith. And you can tell when he's talking to the women, he has this sense of righteousness about him. And that's really a part of his character. And you get a lot of that because with his sun in Sagittarius, as well as his moon in Sagittarius, it's almost a combined effort there that you see exemplified or put more out on the front. So as I mentioned before, Matt has a sun in Sagittarius and a moon in Sagittarius. Both of those planets are squared to Jupiter. Now, this makes things a bit more colorful in his chart. Why? Because you have the sun and moon, their ruling planet, right? The ruling planet of Sagittarius, Jupiter, is in a square or in difficult aspect with both his sun and moon. And what that does is it causes an internal tension, an internal dialogue which Matt struggles with. And whenever you see an aspect or a difficult aspect to the sun, you're looking at something that has to do with, that person's character or even their identity. And you can see how a lot of this plays out in his dialogue regarding, him being biracial, how that's helped to shape his upbringing and how it really informs a lot of his decision making. And that's one of the things that he mentioned early on in the season, that a lot of people sort of expect him to walk this line, being black, but he also identifies as being white. So how does he learn to tiptoe that? And that dialogue, that internal tension that he has within himself is something that he constantly has to work on. And that's what you can see with this square to Jupiter and the sun and moon. And on top of that, Jupiter being in the sign of Virgo, it puts Jupiter in a debilitated state. Jupiter is in the sign of its detriment. What that means is Jupiter's energy, Jupiter's fortune and good luck and expansion that it's so known for is being held back by a lot of Virgo's attention to detail. Virgo, the sign of Virgo tends to focus on a lot of minutia, over-analysis, sometimes pettiness, which would be a dark side to Virgo. And that is holding back Jupiter's optimism, Jupiter's need to grow and expand. So you have Matt's key planets, the sun and the moon, being in a square with Jupiter in its sign of its detriment. So a lot of those things play a factor when we talk about Matt and his identity and sort of this internal struggle that he's going through. One thing to note in Matt's chart is Matt has no oppositions. So all of the difficult aspects in his chart are squares, which means that a lot of his struggles are his own. They're his own internal struggles that he's going through. A lot of those obstacles are within him. And you could take a look at one of my previous videos where I talk about how certain aspects manifest themselves differently. Another thing that jumps out at me from Matt's chart is this Mars conjunct moon aspect that he has. Typically, when someone has a Mars conjunct the moon, or Mars in aspect to the moon in general, you'll see that person has a lot of fiery emotion, right? Specifically with the conjunction to Mars and the moon, that person has a tough time really holding back this potentially angry energy that they have, this angry emotional side of them that comes out. With every chart, you have to consider all aspects together holistically, right? On the surface, the Mars conjunct moon would look like someone is just always angry and shouting and over the top. However, what works in Matt's favor is this moon sextile to Saturn. Now, what that means to me is that all of that energy, that emotional energy that would bubble over as anger or rage in Matt's chart, is being held back in a good way by Saturn, right? The sextile represents a favorable aspect. So you have this moon conjunct Mars, which is also squared Jupiter. So on its face, it looks like Matt should be one of those really angry people that's just always bubbling over with rage, and Jupiter being there in a negative aspect would exacerbate that anger and exacerbate that emotion. However, you have Saturn in a favorable aspect with the moon, which helps to control that emotional outburst, helps to rein it in. So Matt may have an outlook on emotion which is very objective. Maybe he approaches emotional problems from a point of view where it's structured, meaning he has a step-by-step way of looking at emotion. Typically, people give Saturn a bad rap, which isn't always fair, right? Because when Saturn is in a good aspect with a planet, Saturn helps to structure. Saturn helps to give that person the ability to take step-by-step movements to get to a certain outcome. So with Saturn in a favorable aspect to the moon, Matt has a very controlled emotional output, as opposed to what he would have if he didn't have that aspect, right? He would be a tyrant, like, think about the Incredible Hulk. This aspect by itself the Mars-Moon conjunction square Jupiter would be someone that's just outrageously angry or really over the top. And thinking back to what I just said, Jupiter is being held back by Virgo. So normally, this would expand his emotion over the top, but Jupiter itself is being held back as well. So this all helps to give Matt a more charming emotional output or emotional demeanor. And all of this works in his favor because the ladies love this man. And on top of that, the moon sextile to Saturn gives you a look into how he views his mom, right? There's a favorable aspect going on there. Maybe his mom was the authoritarian in his life, the structure, the teacher, the person that really guided him and taught him those lessons, which is why he holds his mom in such favorable esteem. I mean, most people do, but if someone like Matt, who, you know, looks to his mother as that guiding light, this aspect, moon sextile Saturn, would tell you why. Something else that's interesting and really serves the purpose for why Matt is on the show is his Venus in Libra. Typically, when you look in a chart, you want to understand, all right, is this a man's chart or you're looking in a woman's chart? For men, you want to look to Venus to see how they view relationships with women. For women, you want to look to Mars to see how they view their relationships with men. Now, with Matt, he has a Venus in Libra. Typically, Venus in Libra people have a really strong desire for partnership, right? You have Venus, the sign of love, and Libra, the sign of relationships and partnerships and marriage and union. So typically, this placement of Venus would give someone the rush to get into a relationship. Now, keep in mind, Matt's Venus is squared Saturn. So let's go back to what Saturn is. Saturn is the planet of restriction. Saturn holds you back. So with Venus squared Saturn, there's an internal tension there going on. We see that happening a lot with Matt. So what does that mean? With Venus in hard aspect to Saturn, it gives Matt a hesitancy about relationships. The hesitancy probably comes from past relationships failing due to Matt's approach to relationships. It's likely he approaches them in a cold, calculated manner that you find with Saturn. He approaches love in a sense where it's duty and responsibility and structure. If Matt is approaching a relationship as that authority figure or that teacher or that instructor, this may turn women off. This is sort of counter to the way Matt goes on dates. And on the show, you see Matt is very outgoing, personable, lovable on a date. However, when he goes into a relationship, that switch might flip. This becomes like a responsibility to him. This might throw women off when they thought they were going to get the fun, lovable Matt that does all these crazy ass dance moves. But in fact, when the relationship starts, they get a more conservative, matured Matt that is really sort of reserved in a relationship because he sees relationships as such a serious thing. This aspect to me means Matt is looking for a more mature type of woman, which is why it's not hard to see why he gave Anna and Victoria the boot. This Saturn-like approach to relationships means that he'll find the most success in a relationship with a woman that is more dignified, mature, or she takes the relationship just as serious as he does. It also could indicate how Matt views money and finance. Venus, being the planet that rules money, is square Saturn, which means that Matt either is very cheap or he spends a lot on things that look nice. And based on the way he's been dressing on the show, it's probably the latter. So there's a lot going on in Matt's chart. A lot of it is centered around how he approaches relationships and how he has a strong sense of morality and righteousness that you really see on the show. It comes out on Front Street. And you know, we can go on more about a lot of the other aspects that we see just to really get an understanding about his mentality in general. And if we had his rising sign or the time of his birth, we'd really get a deeper understanding about how these aspects affect his life, or where in his life you see these things manifest themselves. Tell me what you think about this season of The Bachelor. How is it going so far? Which person do you want to see Matt with? Tell me in the comments below. And if you happen to know or can validate Matt's birth time, put that down there as well. Then we can really dive deep into who he is. Personally, I'd like to see Matt end up with Michelle or Bree, because I think they'd make a good match for him. And I haven't looked at any of the contestants' charts, because there's a lot of them at this point. But maybe once we get down to 3 or 4, maybe 2 of the finalists, then we can really look in their charts and see if we think that the relationship is going to really be a lasting one. So if you enjoyed this video, let me know if there's any other Bachelor Nation people you want me to do a deep dive on their chart. We can make this a running segment. Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll be doing a lot more videos like this and doing a lot more Bachelor Nation stuff on there where we could talk about Matt's chart in a lot more detail. Until then, I'll see you in the next video.